Hello, everyone. Welcome. It is Thursday, November 5th. It has been a long few days. I'm just waiting for our amazing guest to join us, Myrna Pérez. Here we go. Please, in the comment section, ask any questions you have. But first, let us know who you're from and also how you voted. Was it in person, early on election day, by mail? Did you drop off your ballot? Your stories. Hi, Myrna.
Hi, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. Probably like you, sleep deprived, but hanging in there.
My spirits are good. My spirits are good.
Yeah.
I'm very proud of Americans.
Same. So, want to first introduce you. I obviously have loved being in the trenches with you, so to speak, and but would love to hear kind of what Brennan Center is all about and cover that first. Yeah.
Good. And it's funny, I'm noticing just like how bedraggled I look.
It's fine. No, it's fine. This is now.
I'm an election lawyer, and it's been a really long election season.
It's my sixth one, so I'm getting used to this too. But it's different. I'm kind of liking it. Go ahead.
Sure. So the Brennan Center is a nonpartisan nonprofit. We're based in New York City. We are named after the great late Justice William Brennan, who made famous the idea of a living constitution. And by that, he decided that, or he believed that the Constitution shouldn't be thought of as like static words that are like frozen in time, but rather a document that was like adaptive and responsive and could meet the challenges of the moment. And we have a very interdisciplinary way of doing work where we spend a lot of time doing research and reports. We spend a lot of time trying to get legislation passed at the state and federal level. We spend a lot of time litigating and writing amicus briefs and in the courtroom. And then we spend a lot of time talking to public, going to church basements, talking on Instagram and to the media to make sure that voters are informed and voters are educated. And I like being here, and I like that way of work because it prevents me from being under the impression that just because I have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I'm always able to think, well, what is the best way to resolve this problem? And if I'm not successful here, what do I do there? So yeah, it's an interdisciplinary model, and I think that I really enjoy doing it. And we are institutionalists. Like, we try to reform the institutions of our democracy to try and make them work for everybody so that they're more robust and participatory and inclusive.
Got it. Cool. So would love to hear your take about kind of broadly where we are. Obviously, I think there are a lot of anxious voters right now looking at election results, but kind of if you would, I know the panels that we've obviously been on together, like you've actually expressed how impressed and how hopeful you've been with the American people leading up to this election. So one, actually talk about that, because I love that perspective.
Sure. I mean, I have to say that our elections are something that we do not take good enough care of in this country. We're not very good stewards of our elections. I think even under the best of circumstances, we are underfunding and under-resourcing our elections. We don't give election administrators the kind of staff that they need, the kind of respect that they need, the kind of professional training that they need. And when you take that underfunding and that under-resourcing and then put it on top of the largest customer base in the country, and then you put that on top of a once-in-a-century pandemic, you're going to have a lot of gaps and a lot of cracks in the system. And I think I'm really, really proud of the field. I'm really proud of voters. I'm really proud of advocates, because in a very short order, we were able to pull off an election that certainly worked out a lot better than it did in the primaries. And there were a lot of problems. There were a lot of challenges. There were a lot of things that we need to talk about how we're going to fix and how we're going to improve. But I think we have come a really far away. And what I would like to be in a position is where we can say that every election we are producing a top flight democracy. I think our people deserve it. I think we know how to do it. And it's just a matter of overcoming just old ideas about how we're going to get democracy on the cheap, which I think we're not going to. I think and I also think that we need to take a long, hard look about how we are proactive about improving our elections. I think few serious people would dispute that our election system has been built on top of a system that was exclusionary, built on top of a system that had a tremendous amount of racial bias in it. It was built on top of a system that didn't anticipate Americans the way that Americans now exist. And I don't think we're somehow magically going to erase all of the challenges that kind of history weighs us down with. And so I would like for us to be in a position where we are actively being proactive about how to address some of these issues. Like, I don't think it's enough to say that, we're not purposely trying to do X, we're not purposely trying to do Y. I would flip it and I would be like, how are we being inclusive? How are we being welcoming? How are we being robust? And where we have gaps, let's fix them. Let's put them on a list and get them done one by one.
Yeah. So how, actually on that note, like what are the policies? What are the things that we need to do aside from, obviously we need a huge investment. Like even this year we saw that looking at what was requested to run these elections, there was like 1% of it actually given to election officials. But what are some of the, aside from dollars that we need to invest, what are some of the things that, like policies, because I know you guys look at a lot of the policies and how they impact access to the ballot, really, particularly for marginalized communities.
Right. So, I mean, I think there's like big things and then there's little things. Like the big thing is we need to make good on the promise that we made in our Constitution that when you step into the ballot box, you will be free from racial discrimination in voting. The best way that Americans had figured out how to make good on that promise was a really strong and robust Voting Rights Act. It's less strong and less robust right now. So we need another one that is equally strong and equally robust. We're going to need to live up to that promise if we are going to be the kind of country that I believe that most of us want to be. We also need to make sure that we are working really hard to figure out where in the system are people excluded. So for example, there are lots of Americans that don't realize that in many states, the vast majority of states, you can't register on election day. You have to have planned in advance to meet a deadline, to go through some hoops in order to get registered. We don't need to do it that way. We can have a really aggressive system of registering voters as we encounter them, as they go to libraries, as they go to public universities, as they go to Medicaid offices, as they go to the DMV. And we can put them on the rolls unless they affirmatively decide that they don't want to be. That's something called automatic voter registration, and a little bit under 20 states have it. And it's certainly not as expansive as it needs to be, but that's something we can do. We can also have election day registration for the people that didn't get registered before election day. We can have online registration for folks who either don't spend a lot of time at government agencies but want to be registered before election day. And that's the first step in the process. We can also make sure that voting is like easy and convenient for people, where we can have really expansive early voting opportunities, so people don't have to worry as much about, when can they find childcare, when can they get off work, when are they going to be able to borrow a ride or get a ride there. We can also make it such that people can vote by mail if that is the best way for them to do so. If they don't trust the vote by mail system, we can set up drop boxes. We can set up ballot return locations. And then finally, we can have rules that make sure that if voters are making like these technical mistakes that have nothing to do with whether or not they're eligible, we can make sure that those ballots get counted. We can make sure that they get noticed. We can make sure that they are able to fix these mistakes. Don't get me started about one of my favorite things, which is like enough polling locations and enough poll workers and enough like machines. Like those things to me are like baseline. Those are things that we need to be doing well enough, and we're not doing that enough. So I think at every stage in the system, we can do that. But one of the things that I really like about Rock the Vote is that y'all are an organization that looks at like a large lifespan of folks. So like, one thing I think we're going to have to do is continue to make the case for an inclusive democracy. I think we need to be in a position where we are explaining to people that our democracy works best if it includes all of us, so that all these politicians who are trying to monkey around and try to manipulate people and change the rules of the game, like that they know that that's not what voters want, and that they're not going to be politically rewarded for this. In fact, they're going to be politically punished for this. I mean, if we went and thought about how people voted and people made, how accessible did you make our democracy as one of the issues you voted on, I think people would change their behavior, right? Like when people are making scorecards and deciding how does this person vote, like, why aren't we asking, how do you feel about voting rights? And do you believe in expansive voting rights, even if it's for someone that you don't agree with politically? I think that would make a really, really big impact.
Yeah. So one of the questions, and usually I wouldn't bring this up, but one of the questions I saw earlier, and feel free, folks who are watching, to put your questions in here, was claims of voter fraud. Can you talk about that? Because Brennan Center.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it, but it's very, very tiresome. It's very, very tiresome. Study after study after study tells us a few things. One, our election systems, for the most part, are pretty secure. And when there are threats, the threats usually come from like foreign cyber criminals, way more than they come from individual voters. This widespread, systematic abuse by an individual voter by trying to cast one more vote, it's extraordinarily rare. It almost never happens. And we don't make very good policy on that. Like, we're not assessing like risk and potential versus like whether or not the cure is worse than what the disease was. And so we also know that politicians use the idea of fraud as a justification for a lot of really terrible things, a lot of really exclusionary practices, for a lot of practices that make it harder for minorities and old people and people who are on the margins from being able to participate. And this was something really interesting this year. I'm a lawyer, and what we saw was voter fraud not being used as a shield, but as a sword. And if I can explain that, I will. Usually when someone like me goes in and sues a state for their bad policy, the response is, oh, well, we had to do it because we had to stop voter fraud. We saw in courthouses all across the country lawsuits being filed to stop reforms because of voter fraud, saying that reform that opens up access, that reform that makes it so that more people can participate and vote, is improper because it might promote voter fraud. And you know what? It was a giant nothing burger. Every single time we were like, show us the fraud, show us how it creates fraud, show us what you're worried about. They came up with nothing. And I think it is really, really damaging that people can throw around voter fraud and not have to back it up. Like, that's a serious charge. It has consequences, and it makes it really hard to have honest conversations about how it is that we improve our election system when you're trying to like battle this integrity question that's being raised, and when people aren't actually having real conversations because someone is saying something that they know is not true. And I think that cheapens our dialogue. I think that cheapens our ability to make improvements, and it also just makes it really, really hard to figure out how we fix things.
Yeah, the danger of voter fraud is just the narrative. I mean, that's really what it is. And one thing I always talk about with young people a lot of times is how it has actually created the basis or the excuse to make us think we need things like ID laws, which are specifically targeted at young people. But those are a fairly new voter suppression tactic, if I'm not
Right.
mistaken.
Yeah, those are reasonably new, but voter fraud as an excuse are not voter
Right.
fraud as an excuse is not new. But what I think people are missing is that um, politicians and insiders manipulating the rules of the game
Yeah.
at happens
Yeah.
way more than an individual voter tries to cheat the system, right?
Yeah.
Like, we really should be thinking about it as like, when is fraud being perpetrated upon voters as opposed to when are voters
Yeah.
committing that fraud? And I think a lot enough people are doing about that, because it's just like fraud, 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 fraud. And it's not useful. It's not constructive. I think people are starting to just really not buy it. I think courts are not buying it. I think people are holding, plaintiffs that use it in court systems to their proof, and, expecting people to show for it, because it just, again, it prevents us from solving the problem. And I spend a lot of my time looking at data and realizing that you cannot optimize everything that's good, right? Like, that's what policy is. You are not going to be able to find a way to make sure that you maximize everything that you want to maximize. So you have to be making priorities and choices. And it is really, really hard to be making those priorities and choices when people are distorting some of the things that you need to be worried about. Like, when you don't actually have like a realistic assessment of what it is you're trying to fix, you do not know how much you need to weigh that against other potential tinkers to the system that you can do. So like, I don't, which is why you'll never hear like a serious academic or a serious researcher or a serious litigator say that there's no voter fraud. We'll say that it's a highly rare. It's really, really rare. And like, what are we going to do about things that are like statistically approaching zero? And how much weight are we going to give them when we are trying to balance a whole bunch of other really important things?
Yep. So it is Thursday, 2 days after. I was gonna say, I like that. Chaos is the point. So right now, it feels like, I think, to a lot of voters that we might be in a state of chaos, but we're actually not in a state of chaos.
Yeah, I'm feeling way more zen than I was the day before the election.
Exactly. That's how I felt. Someone goes, how are you doing? And I'm like, this is the first time I've like sat down and like had a breath. And so can you talk about kind of why you're feeling that way and where we are right now?
Well, I think our process is doing its thing. Like, we have many states that allow lots of people to vote by mail. We have many states that allow people to mail them in a timely way and will count them after they come in. We have states that allow people to correct technical defects. We have states that are doing audits, which also take time. Like, we don't have enough states doing all of the things that we need to do to make sure that we have an accurate count, but we have a lot of states that do a lot of things that have an accurate count, and those states aren't done yet. And I think most people would agree that it is way more important that we count every eligible vote, that we have an accurate count over speed. Like, we are a long time away between now and when these states have to certify their election results, right? Like, they don't actually get certified. Like, people are under the impression. Today I had or maybe it was yesterday, some caller into a show that I was in thought that the media got to call who won. And I'm like, that's not how it works. They make a prediction based on like numbers that they see. And they have lots of statisticians who are supposed to tell them, how likely is your prediction right? And we all know that sometimes they're wrong and sometimes they're right. But like, the election doesn't actually get decided till states certify like who the winner was and the electors cast their ballot. And that's not the day of the election. That's
Yeah.
not the day of the election. It's afterwards. And we just don't see that so much because so much of it has been a bit more invisible because we've had fewer mail ballots than in the past. And we haven't had this very like public and protracted litigation. But like, you know, in my mind, the process is working mostly as it has been. I wish we weren't having all these like nuisance lawsuits because you know, as a lawyer, I don't like our judicial system being clogged up with like distractions, but I think the process is working.
Yeah. I was going to say, I am feeling like we need to start a movement of media and everyone else calling these counts and not results, so that only when they're certified are they actually results. But that's
or predictions or estimates or something,
right.
right?
Yeah.
Predictions or estimates or something. It's all math. Like, and I think it's so funny that someone will say like so-and-so's ahead when only 3% of the ballots are in. I'm like, who cares about that? That is statistically meaningless at this point. Like, why are you telling people that? Like, you know, like you should be telling them we've only got 3%. And if you really care, like I don't start even listening to that till the number's a lot higher.
Yeah, we've actually had, who have we had on? I was going to say earlier we had Tiana from CTCL, obviously, talking about
one of my favorite people.
Yep, talking about the process and kind of what local election officials are going through right now. So we've talked about the difference between processing ballots, which some of these states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin weren't able to even start processing them until election day, where some states had weeks to do this. And then how most of the states started counting and tabulating them. But can you talk a little bit about, you know, the certificate, like what does it mean to certify? And I know that's different for each state, but what does that actually mean?
So it is different for every state. So, you know, those of you that are really interested should look online, but at a very high level, it's the idea of saying, we've counted the ballots. This is what it is. We've collected them. We've done the double checks that we're going to do. This is who won. This is what the ballots look like. And, you know, and there's a process for it. And, you know, and different states have different deadlines and all the courts are working really hard, I think, when they're getting these nuisance lawsuits to try and, you know, meet all these certification deadlines. But I do think Americans have gotten, we've gotten put in a position where we've gotten used to something that was untenable. Like, I think, you know, everyone sensible, I think, would agree that we want to give voters ample time to return their ballots. And we certainly don't want to be not counting ballots because of mistakes that the post office made when we can possibly help it. I think most people don't want eligible voters to not get their ballot counted because they forgot to put it in an inner envelope or they forgot to sign it, right? They want to be able to test it. They want to be able to give voters a chance to be like, no, this is who I am. This is how I intended to vote. You know, let me do this last stuff that I need to fix it. And I do think that voters want to have confidence that the machines weren't hacked or that there was no sort of flipping or funny business. And so we need those audits. And those things don't magically happen in an instant. Those
Right.
things happen, you know, over a period of time, and they get checked and they get double checked. And, you know, and that's not very conducive to a result on election night or a certification on an election night or even accurate prediction on election night. So I think we will all be better served again, you know, when we think about what are the things that we're trying to do in our elections and accepting that we can't do them all at the same level and, you know, and get the same kind of, you know, we're going to have to be making choices. And I, for one, and I suspect most people would prefer an accurate and inclusive count over a speedy count.
Yeah, we had Chris Landa from Verified Voting talking about audits and how important it is to have that paper trail too. How we've made some progress since 2016 because several of these states have them before, but now we have them, so that's an important part of it. So what, and you referencing the basically the two ballot or the two envelope component being obviously or for those who are tuning in who don't know, the naked ballot issue in Pennsylvania that requires two envelopes for secrecy purposes. In terms of the initial counts and certification and these legal challenges that may or may not happen, well, some of them are happening, but some of them might still come. What does that what does that process look like? Like, does that have to be figured out before the certification process? Does it happen after?
Well, the lawsuits are all happening and they're hoping to get done in a timely enough way to have an impact. But I need to like assure everybody, like thus far, we have not seen a lawsuit that is going to, that is likely to have an impact thus far. I mean, we are seeing like these nuisance lawsuits, like some poor federal judge, like somebody bothered a federal judge for like 2.5 hours yesterday over 93 ballots, none of whom they argued was voted by anybody who wasn't supposed to be voting. Like the question was whether or not all of the rules had been followed in the appropriate way by the election administrator. Nobody was saying that the voters did anything wrong there, and it was 93 ballots and a federal judge. We're seeing all these lawsuits where folks are wanting to stop the count. No one's arguing that the voters are being improper or that the ballots were improper. They just want the ballot that's stopped because, some guy in Michigan was escorted out. We've been hearing about days, this lawsuit that's supposedly going to be filed in Nevada that's going to show big evidences of fraud. It hasn't come yet. Like maybe it will. When it does, we'll deal with it. But like thus far, there has not been a lawsuit that has actually said that voters who weren't supposed to be voting did anything. Instead, there's an issue about like, were there, did they have the ballot secrecy sleeve? Did they get delivered in time by the post office? Were the observers there at the right amount of time? Did the election administrator mess up by giving them a chance to fix it? Nobody's saying that all these people that shouldn't be voting were voting. And I think that there's something really messed up about the fact that we have political campaigns trying to get individual voters' ballots thrown out. Like, they're not working at, should the rules be X, should the rules be Y? Like what they are suggesting in a number of instances is that these particular ballots should not be counted. And, I'm hoping that the American public doesn't stand for that. I think most people, irrespective of your political leanings, believe that our democracy works best when it hears from all of us.
So on that note, are there things you would tell voters right now that they can do or should be doing, or let's start with that, and then, or paying attention?
Well, right. I mean, I think the first thing I would do is think about your own election experience and the election experience of people close to you and figure it out. What could have been better? What could somebody have done better? Like if somebody was determined to give you the best customer service, what would that have looked like? If someone was trying to make it as easy for you as possible to be able to cast the valid ballot, what would they be doing? And then figure out if there's a policy that looks like that. Talk to experts in the area, talk to your neighbors, talk to your legislators and figure out if you can be part of an engine that makes your state, the gold standard for voting.
Yeah.
And I think if all of us decided that we weren't going to just accept all these growth opportunities as being a foregone conclusion, but something we can actually fix because we can fix most of them, and decided, what, we're just gonna, like, America is going to be the best democracy in the world. We're going to pay for it. We're going to invest in it. We're going to make sure we train people for it. Like, I think we'd be in a much better place, and then we could work on a lot of the other big issues that are thorny and hard that we need to deal with. We're not gonna be able to tackle all of the very many issues that are facing this country if we don't get our election system sorted out, because that is the way we resolve our political differences peacefully. That is the way we set the direction of the country. So like that part really needs to be working.
Yep, that's absolutely true. I know when sometimes we work with any group that works on a particular issue, they just get frustrated because the issues don't move because elections don't move. Like it doesn't work the way it should for people in general.
And this is all preventable. I mean, it's really funny. Like people will ask me like, what do you think of long lines, for example? Is it just like, enthusiasm? I'm like, it's not. The word is not just, it's an and, right? Like it is both potentially a system of a sign of a lot of enthusiasm and a per se problem. Somebody didn't do something right. They either didn't predict how many people would show up, they didn't hire enough poll workers, they didn't hire enough voting machines, they didn't provide enough public education as to what people should do and what the other options are. Like we need to be looking at our election system and decide, like, how are we going to make this A plus, right? Like, how are we going to make this A plus?
Like, how build it for that enthusiasm. So it's not enthusiasm is creating long lines, but it's actually promoting. Let me see any other questions we have in here that I might have missed. If you do have any questions, and I know we're getting late for East Coast folks, and I very much appreciate your time, Myrna. It is always a pleasure. Yeah, someone just asked how you're doing.
I am so proud of our country. Like, we're voting in a pandemic. We're voting when we had politicians at very high levels of government, call, like, I'm trying to think of a polite word, call people to be policing folks at the polls. Like, we had so much misinformation. We had so much disinformation. We had so many politicians posturing, and we turned out. Like, you know, we showed up and we volunteered and we helped other people. And I think that that's really beautiful. And I think that's really powerful. And no matter who won or lost any particular election, I think the message was given loud and clear that Americans care about voting. They care about our democracy. And the part that we have not yet figured out yet is how to make sure that our politicians get scared when they try to keep our democracy for themselves. Like, how do we make sure that they know that that is a losing proposition for them, that that will be politically toxic, that they will not win if they continue to try and keep our democracy like closed and exclusive. And so I think that that's like a good thing for us to think about. Like, you know, how do we make, you know,
it's like, where do you stand on the issue of voting, or where do you stand on the issue of democracy? Are you pro-democracy or are you anti-democracy?
And are you pro having every eligible American that wants to participate voting?
Yeah.
Right. Is that what you are? And if you are, like, what are you going to do about it? And how are you going to do it? And it's funny because I'm probably older than a lot of your viewers, but like, I'm not so old that it's crazy that I remember when the idea of having robust and participatory election systems was a bipartisan issue. Mm-hmm. I remember that. I remember when politicians from all walks of life and from all different political parties thought that it made sense to say in a very clear voice, in this country, we care about the right to vote. We protect it. We want our neighbors to be able to vote.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think some of them, if you got them in a closed room, would say that. But for political reasons, they don't act that way.
Yeah.
I do see a question. Can this be a show? We are, maybe, we'll see, Myrna. You want to start 2021?
Tell the networks I'm available.
I was going to say, we will definitely, we have more ideas coming. I think we have one that's going to be a self-care tomorrow, but Monday we will start them back up, and we're going to do education around ballot measures and electoral college. And what else do we have? Ranked choice voting and a whole bunch of other stuff.
Well, if you're going to do a segment on the Voting Rights Act,
yeah,
because that's my jam. That's my jam. I want us all to pass a revised Voting Rights Act.
I was going to say, well, on that note, do you want to give like just a few minutes on it?
Yes, but you still have to call me back so that I get 30 minutes to talk about my beloved Voting Rights Act.
Yes. We'll have like Voting Rights Act like month or something like that.
Yeah, so people may not know this, but the House passed the Voting Rights Advancement Act, which was really, really exciting. And what it would try to do was to undo some of the damage that the Supreme Court did in a decision called Shelby County. It had two really important parts where it took Rusty, yeah, it's now called the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. That's right. But at the time it was passed, it was the Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is why I'm still referring it to that way. What it did was it took those jurisdictions that have a history of racial discrimination in voting and make sure that whenever they would make a policy change to their voting system, that they could establish that this wasn't going to make minority voters worse off, or wasn't attempted to try and make minority voters worse off. It also looks at those practices that we know are like sketchy, like those practices that over time have been used to be keeping some people from voting, and puts it on the jurisdiction that wants to enact those practices to be able to show again why this policy won't make minority voters worse off. And like, so this is really important because it's not rigid. It doesn't say never, ever, ever can you not do X. It says, you know, we've got the history, we've got a reason to be a little skeptical. Show us why this is not going to be damaging. And if you can do that, then you'll be able to do it. It also has these really interesting things about making sure that voters get a lot of information and a lot of notice when election changes. That way people understand like what the rules of the game are and how they're working on it. It has provisions for letting election administrators get support from other parts of the government to make sure that people are monitoring it and protecting voters. I mean, there's a lot of really good things in this bill. And we really need it. I think that we have seen over, you know, the last, you know, few years, states put unnecessary barriers in front of the ballot box, and they are almost always going to impact communities of color the hardest. I mean, that's sort of that's like the dirty secret of these barriers. Like every time there's a barrier to voting, it is going to impact the people whose margins are the tightest, right? Like, you know, if there's a really long line, I'm not going to get fired from standing in it so that I can vote. And when you have people who are, by definition are on margins with tight margins, these barriers just become one more thing that they have to overcome. And it's not just overcoming that particular barrier. They have to overcome the psychology that says, we don't want you voting. You're not welcome. Like, we're going to make it as hard as we can for you to participate. And when that happens, especially to people for whom there have been active efforts to exclude them from so many of our institutions, like, people are going to prioritize in different ways. Like, I think we need to hold ourselves accountable for the fact that for too long in this country, we have legally we've legally like excluded people from our democracy, and we're not doing enough to welcome them back in. We have to be proactive about it.
Yep. How there is a question, but actually on the VRA, one question I have is, so the House passed this, and it's actually not the first piece of voting rights or democracy reform that we've seen the House pass, but then go nowhere in the Senate, obviously. What would your advice to voters be in 2021 when something like this happens? Or
tell every single one of your senators that you expect them to get the John Lewis Voting Rights Act passed. And, you know, it's not enough if your senator is already in favor of it and that's not enough. You need to tell her or him, you need to make it happen. You need to do the politicking that gets it done. And we need every senator, irrespective of their political background, to know that their voters want this. Their voters want this. We made a promise in the 15th Amendment that we were not going to be a country that discriminated on the basis of race at the ballot box. We made a promise. We went to war over this. This was something that we said was important. This is who we are. We are trying to fix a really like disgusting and shameful part of our history. And we seem to have forgotten how important that is. And look at the consequences we're facing.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that can be done? The VRA is obviously, like, I think for a lot of us, the most important thing for us to restore and banned. That's the federal level, obviously. Then we have,
there's one more important federal bill. It's the For the People Act, which is like a big omnibus piece that takes a look at like all the things that went wrong and tries to set minimum federal standards for it. So states can do better than what's in that bill, but they've got to hit like this minimum floor. So that's obviously something that folks can also be behind. But like, you can also just beat Congress to it. Like, all these people that are like, oh, I don't want Congress telling us what to do. That's fine. Make your state do it and do it better, because the For the People Act has all these exceptions for states that already do a better job than what the floor they're setting is. If you don't want Congress telling you what to do, that's fine. Just take care of your business and get it done.
I like the way you put it. That's good. Just take care of your business. Hold your local and state elected officials accountable.
Yeah, like if you don't want Congress telling you what to do, fine. Pass a better law. Yeah. Pass a bunch of better laws. Make your state the gold standard. There will be all sort of exemptions in the For the People Act for states that do it better than what Congress is setting out to do. Easy, right? Like, not that we just have to decide that we're prioritizing this.
Yeah,
we can do this.
Yep. There is a question about election interference and intimidation right now and the consequences, either federal or state. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes. I mean, look, I think there's a lot we can be really excited about in the elections, but I suspect that once we do the analysis, we are going to find out that like random, individualized intimidation was higher than in other states. Like, I can tell you that I have never heard of so many incidences of people with trucks, people with guns, people screaming, people trying to block, thankfully voters persisted, and thankfully things were mostly peaceable. It was just largely like uncomfortable, but we do need to figure out, what are we going to do about those people that seem to think that rather than persuading other voters as to their viewpoint, they want to scare or intimidate other people? Like, we need to be really, really clear that that's not going to work, and that's actually counterproductive to your cause, right? Like, so I do think that we need to talk about how we're going to better deal with what I call like the rando assholes. Like how are we going to deal with those folks, and what are our laws going to look like, and how do we strike the right balance between like political speech and what they're doing, and making sure that everybody's like equipped to know like where the lines are.
Yeah, that's good. I think we actually might try and have Georgetown Law Center on to talk about that, because that's been an area of increasing interest in them. So actually, somewhat maybe related, depending on how you want to frame it, there is a question about, and I realize that we are later than I told you we were going to be, so if you need to hop off, totally respect that, but there are real questions here about observers maintaining a distance, and why that's important.
Okay. Well, each state has different rules for how close you can be, right? Like, you want observers to have transparency, right? Like, we need to have transparency and accountability, but you don't want people hovering or being distracting or being a nuisance. And different states have different rules for where that line gets drawn, and what kinds of things are acceptable and what kind they're not. And we're seeing in a few places someone arguing that it should be closer or it should be further. And, and I think my hope is that we don't come to any like firm conclusions on this while we're in the middle of a once in a century pandemic that is transmitted by air. Like, I think, these have to be done indoors. They're not going to be well ventilated. They don't have, super awesome HVAC systems that like clear all of this stuff. There's not all this extra money to do really great cleaning. You have to be careful with the supplies too that you've got around. So I think there's going to be some differing opinions over how close is too close. And I think, that's something that we can revisit and decide how much flexibility is there in the system. What I do think is problematic is that we're seeing a bunch of lawsuits over really like localized issues. Like there was a lawsuit filed because like one person in Michigan like didn't get to observe as closely as they wanted. You know, like we really have a lot to do right now. And again, when we're trying to talk about, you know, risk and reward and trade-offs and policy choices and how we prioritize things, I think we need to exercise sensible judgment that even if that's not what you would do, is it in the range of things that you find acceptable, right? Like, is it in the range of things that someone of good faith could think was a good idea, you know, and then just kind of understand that, like, you know, it's not up to you. You're not the one that gets to decide. There are other people that decided it, and that's like an acceptable decision. Even if you were the one decider, would you have made a different call?
Yeah, got it. Good. Okay, I think that is it for all the questions. I just want to, Myrna, if there's anything else you want to mention, otherwise I'm going to let you go. And I very much appreciate, well, one, you anytime. I feel like I told actually our team, I was like, I'm kind of fangirling here or fan-womaning here, where I'm just like, I get to talk to like these amazing.
Yeah, you got this is a pretty good gig. I've looked at some of the other, like, those just, I'm sure, really fun conversations. And after such a long election season, like, I'm sure it feels good to be able to be like with people you like, having a conversation. Like, I'm, you know, this is very, very like restful for my soul. So I really appreciate you. And I appreciate this audience. And I'm glad that it's not like a really quick, like soundbitey thing, that we're actually like having a conversation that feels kind of like the conversation we would have had in person if we were there.
That we've been meaning to have for months now. Having on. But well, thank you for joining. Thank you for all you're doing for our democracy and continue to do. And yeah, just all the work that Brendan and you and your team have done.
Okay. Thank you guys. Really appreciate the commitment you guys are making to our democracy.
Thank you, Myrna. Have a good night.
Bye.
And bye.